What is going on, Kane Sport? Izubee Charles joined by Stephen Wagner for another Inside Canes recruiting podcast as we talk the latest in your Miami Hurricanes football recruitment. Stephen and I were recently at the Under Armour Camp Series in Miami, and there were a ton of Miami targets in attendance. Leading the way was 2026 Miami commit Darron Coleman, who was named the quarterback MVP after a great showing, and he was battling out against guys like Diabell and Will Howard, who's committed to Florida, and then Diabell is a five-star prospect committed to Texas. Stephen, before we dive deep into things, what were your overall thoughts about that camp and the amount of Miami targets that were on hand?
Yeah, I mean, hands down, the guy that really impressed me the most was Darron Coleman. I mean, this camp isn't necessarily a camp that's catered toward showing quarterback strengths and weaknesses in terms of their ability to go through a progression, their ability to make reads, make decisions, all of those things. It really shows off more what kids are able to physically do, just kind of what their physical traits are above all else. Darrion really impressed me with his arm. I thought his arm was freaking fantastic. Um, really easy power, very smooth, accurate, quick release, whips the ball out of his hands, tremendous velocity on the ball. A lot of times coming out, that's or coming out of high school, that's something that even that's something that even the really high end quarterbacks can struggle with a little bit is having that velocity on the football. I thought he had better velocity on his throws than Diabell and Will Griffin, just in terms of his pure arm strength, his pure arm talent. I thought his arm talent was undoubtedly better than both of those guys, but man, it just ended up being a who's who of Miami targets at this camp. I mean, you look at some of the guys that ended up showing up. You've got Tadarius Hughes, the Florida State commit. You've got Derek Cooper, one of the top running backs in the country. Javian Mallory, another top running back, and a top Miami commit. Calvin Russell, or I'm sorry, Javian Mallory, a top Miami target. Um, uh, uh, Calvin Russell, who right now it's looking like Miami and Syracuse are going to be in the best positions. Messiah Hampton, the 4-star receiver from New York, who I mean was just an absolute stud, ended up being on three's MVP from the camp. I thought he was a freaking baller. I mean, I thought he just looked way better than he even does on his highlight tape, and his highlight tape is pretty freaking impressive. Really loved what I saw from him all around. I really was impressed by the overall turnout that Miami ended up, or that we ended up seeing. Probably not as deep with offensive linemen and defensive linemen as it's been in years past, but the skill positions absolutely did not disappoint. There was a good complement of running backs, linebackers, receivers, defensive backs, and then obviously quarterback with Darrion Coleman. Skill positions, definitely looked really good. I would say top to bottom, a little bit light in the trenches.
Yeah, no, for sure. Obviously, South Florida known for speed, and there was a ton on display, on Sunday. And Steven, obviously, we started off the show talking about, Darren Coleman winning that MVP. Want to move on to the next, that pretty much next position, running back. Obviously, we saw two of Miami's top targets in that 2026 class, Javian Mallory, as you mentioned, and Derek Cooper. Javian also won, MVP honors at that running back position. So Miami is targeting a lot of skillful guys, and two of their top targets and one of their commits, won MVP honors. And obviously we've been talking a ton about Javian Mallory on this site, on the message board, and everything in between. And it really looks like Miami's trending in the right direction with him. Steven, I feel pretty confident about where Miami stands with Javian. I think it's a matter of when, he announces that commitment at this point. Obviously, Michigan and Notre Dame are pushing, but just what are your thoughts on Javian Mallory and where things stand with the Canes?
Love Javian Mallory. Love his chances of ending up at Miami. We've been blowing it up on the site quite a bit lately. I feel fantastic about where Miami sits. There's a ton of schools still after him. He showed up wearing an Ohio State backpack, which I thought was kind of amusing, but that absolutely had zero effect on how I feel about Miami. Now, I haven't been able to get anyone in his camp to say this, but asking around, I do feel like Miami could kind of start looking like the team to beat, quite honestly. I think the Hurricanes are just doing an absolutely tremendous job. I mean, man, this is Matt Merritt. Merritt has been on Mallory since he arrived in Coral Gables. Merritt was even recruiting Mallory whenever he was the running backs coach at USF. Quite frankly, USF probably wasn't going to get a guy like Javian Mallory, but he absolutely did start building that relationship. It transferred seamlessly over to Miami. Hurricanes, I am absolutely going to call the team to beat for Javian Mallory. I just feel tremendous. I feel tremendously about the Hurricanes' chances. Can't say enough good things about Mallory in Miami.
Yeah, I agree. And before we move on to talking a little bit about Derek Cooper, had a chance to, talk with Javen a little bit off the record. And I just, picked his brain about Miami. And he said, love who loves you. He says he wakes up, from a text from our Cristobal, goes to sleep, with the text from our Cristobal. So the Canes are really, really recruiting him, showing him that he is wanted in Miami, in Coral Gables. And that's really making a big impact on him. I wouldn't be surprised to see if this, pops off, sometime in the spring. But not to get ahead of myself, but do think the Canes are in a very, very good spot with Javen Mallory. Moving on to another, South Florida running back, Derek Cooper, a guy that, has been relatively quiet these last few weeks, but he showed up at the camp. He did his thing. He's already an Under Armour All-American, already played in that game. So, he wasn't going to, get the MVP or anything like that at that camp, but well deserving of it after, the show he put on Sunday. And he's a guy, Miami's in the mix. We've talked about it a lot on the board as well. Hurricanes are looking to take two backs in this 2026 class, and Derek Cooper's right up there alongside Javian Mallory. But a little bit different of a situation with this one. Obviously, Cooper still has programs such as Ohio State, Auburn, Georgia, and others pushing for him. Has official visits set to all those three schools and Miami as well. He's going to get back on campus in the spring, which I think is going to be absolutely massive for him as he continues to progress through this process. Stephen, what are your quick thoughts on Derek Cooper and where things stand as well?
I think Miami's doing well. It's starting to feel a little bit like Miami is gaining a little bit of momentum. We know the Hurricanes are going to work incredibly hard to keep him home. They do not want him leaving their backyard. And honestly, I mean, you kind of just look at the I don't want to say intangibles, but you look on paper at kind of where things sit with or at the I don't even know what I'm trying to say. Derek Cooper goes to Chaminade Madonna. He's in Miami's backyard. The pieces are there on paper that kind of make it feel like he's going to be one of these guys that ends up at Miami. The Hurricanes have recruited Chaminade exceptionally well over the last few years, with the obvious exception being Jeremiah Smith and by extension Cedric Bailey. The Hurricanes failed to land those two guys, but outside of that, Miami has really had their pick of kids at Chaminade. They've done whatever it's taken to keep those guys home. Last year they chose to go after Chris Ewald and Dante Simpson, kept those guys. Before that, they wanted Zaquan Patterson and JoJo Trader. They got those guys. Like I said, obviously things didn't work out with Jeremiah Smith and Cedric Bailey. And this year, it's looking really, really good for Derek Cooper and Jason Lopez. I love where Miami sits with both of those guys. Right now, I'm probably more confident in Miami's chances for Lopez than I am for Cooper, just because Cooper has so many huge programs after him. But Miami's I would say right now, just kind of my opinion, Miami's probably the biggest school that is showing major, major, major interest in a kid like Jason Lopez. And I do think that holds a lot of weight with Jason, being able to potentially stay home and play in Coral Gables, being able to play for a major school like Miami and having that opportunity. So I think that absolutely makes a lot of sense. I think the Chaminade pipeline is alive and well. I think the Chaminade pipeline is going to pay off again in this year's cycle.
Yeah, I feel like that's a perfect transition into our next position group, wide receiver. You mentioned him, Jason Lopez. He's a guy that I absolutely love, on and off the field. Had the chance to speak with him, a little bit away from football, a little bit away from recruiting. And he's just the type of kid that you want in a program, a guy that, is a team first type of guy. But when it comes down to making plays, he's making, all the ones that matter. And, like you mentioned, Chaminade Madonna has been a program that's produced a lot of top talent that are, making that transition to the University of Miami. And I think the Canes are in a great spot to land him and bring him to Coral Gables. Talked with a few people, around that Chaminade high school staff, and, they say he wants to be in Miami. His family wants him to stay home too. And obviously Coach Mario Cristobal has been involved in that recruitment as well a lot lately. And you just watch the kid. He is a very, very smooth, slot receiver. obviously has that basketball background, so the athleticism is there. And, you know, I had a little bit of a debate on the message board with some people. I called him an elite athlete, and somebody's like, oh, he's not an elite athlete. And then I sent a video of him dunking over 2 people. He's 6 foot tall. Like, I don't know too many 6-footers that are dunking over 2 people. I said, is this not elite to you? If not, I don't know what it is. What there on Sunday showcased he was one of the better wide receivers at that camp. And, you know, I absolutely love his game. Steven, just, you know, after watching him work a little bit on Sunday and then beforehand, you know, during the season, what are your thoughts about Jason Lopez kind of as a slot wide receiver?
He's really, really smooth, quick, crisp route runner. It kind of feels like Miami in each of these last 2 classes has been trying to find their next Xavier Restrepo. It really does look like, you know, they're trying to find a guy that they think, you know, is going to be, you know, is going to basically, you know, have all of his characteristics and bring them to Miami. You know, last year they ended up taking Malachi Toney. Obviously, he was supposed to be in this year's class, reclassified to 2025. You know, he's a guy who I think shares a ton of characteristics with Restrepo. I mean, you know, being kind of a shifty, smaller guy, crisp route runner, good receiver, moves really well in space, does a really good job getting separation, incredibly reliable over the middle. And then you have Jason Lopez in this year's class, who's, you know, pretty much, you know, a slightly different version of kind of the same guy. You know, probably not as thick and bulky as Toney was, but still, you know, really, really talented athlete. I kind of feel like Miami taking Toney in last year's class sort of opened the door for Lopez to be able to potentially come in this year's class, because, you know, obviously, you know, you don't see a ton of schools take 2 players who effectively come in to play the same role and have the same position in a recruiting class. So I think that Toney going in last year's cycle kind of opened the door for a kid like Lopez to be able to sort of emerge as that guy in this year's class. I really like him a lot. Kind of the more that I watch him, really reliable hands, very, very consistent. I do think that, you know, he probably is going to need to add a little bit of weight. I still think that there's some stuff that he could continue to work on as far as getting off the line of scrimmage, but I absolutely do see the pieces there, and I fully get why Miami's interested in him. Like, you know, he's one of those guys where you can tell whenever you watch him, he does look like a guy that could potentially end up that could potentially end up in Miami. He looks like a guy that you can kind of look at and see, okay, I understand what the coaching staff sees in him. He's absolutely starting to show those flashes.
Yeah, he's an absolutely amazing prospect. Like I said, a kid that, you know, you just want in the locker room that's going to be, you know, have a positive impact on the people around him and kind of just, you know, lift up a program. So Jason Lopez is a guy that has my seal of approval. Hopefully, you know, Miami continues to pursue him. He ends up, you know, being Hurricane, because I think he has an enormous amount of potential. Can really be, you know, a star at that next level. Despite, you know, his rankings being a little bit lower, I feel like you can throw those out the window with the production. You know, over 1,300 yards last season, over 80 catches, and, you know, 14 touchdowns for a Chaminade that plays, you know, one of the toughest schedules in the country, week in and week out, battling against some really good DBs. And Jason Lopez, you know, always came out on top of those battles. So that's a guy that I really like. Moving on, Calvin Russell, another wide receiver that Hurricanes are pushing for, that was out there on Sunday. But this is a little bit of a different situation, as you kind of touched about a little bit. Syracuse is a major factor in this one, and this is another one on the boards that, you know, we're talking about a lot. A lot of people are kind of doubting, you know, Fran Brown and Syracuse. Obviously, they're not known for being a, you know, huge football powerhouse and all this stuff. But if you ask around South Florida, you talk to a lot of people, Fran Brown is a very, 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 very popular name when it comes to these South Florida talents. In the 2025 class, he landed 3 guys from Miami Northwestern. You talk to, you know, parents of recruits of the 2026 class, and you hear a lot of kids are saying, hey, I'm taking an OV to Syracuse, or hey, Syracuse has been reaching out a lot and things like that. And, you know, honestly, I think Syracuse is really, really prioritizing South Florida, and, you know, they're doing a great job with a bunch of guys, and Calvin Russell being one of them. Steven, just one of your thoughts on, you know, Miami and Syracuse kind of battling for, you know, Calvin Russell. Obviously, other programs are still in the mix, but right now it looks like those 2 schools are kind of setting the pace for things.
Yeah, I've said this before on Good Morning Cane Sport. Hell, I might have said it in one of these podcasts. But Syracuse for a long time, they were kind of one of those programs that, sort of, not to be crude or anything like that, but they almost sort of feasted off of the scraps in South Florida. They would, they'd come in, they'd get whatever, the leftover talent was that didn't end up going to, one of these huge, large premier universities. And, they did pretty well with it for a long time, kind of in that same range of, like a Pitt or a Boston College, or a Maryland, or name a school like name a school like that. But now Syracuse is actually trying to focus on a whale. They are trying to land a big splash. They're trying to land a big splash commitment that would absolutely be a signature get for Fran Brown. It's pretty rare that talent of that caliber, wants to go to a school like Syracuse. But man, I got to tell you, this is all Fran Brown. He has been absolutely balls to the wall with Calvin Russell for such a long time. I mean, last year, we heard about the effort that Syracuse was making for him. I know that the Orange were definitely making a pretty good effort for him. Hell, they were even able to get him on campus last year whenever Syracuse actually beat Miami in Syracuse. It sounds like that definitely had a strong impression on him. But now that, we're actually this far into his recruitment, I really didn't appreciate just how good of a job Brown was doing and the kind of impact that it was having on Calvin. Syracuse is absolutely a serious player. I would say Syracuse is a straight up threat. If I'm a Miami fan, I am not sleeping easy tonight, knowing the position that Syracuse is in for Calvin Russell. I think the Orange are just absolutely doing a tremendous job. They've made really clear they want to land a whale. That's the whale they've set their sights on. I got to say, I think they have an awesome chance. They really do. It feels to me, as bizarre as this is to say, I kind of feel like Miami has a little bit of ground to make up to catch Syracuse with Calvin Russell. That's how I feel right now.
Yeah, as crazy as it sounds, Syracuse, competing with Miami for one of the top prospects in their backyard. But like you mentioned, Stephen, Fran Brown has taken, complete control of this recruitment and said, hey, we want you really bad in Syracuse. Come up here. And he's giving them a shot. So going to be interesting to see how this unfolds over the next few months. I think this is going to be a recruitment that kind of, finds its way down the line. Calvin Russell says he is in no rush to commit, and, he's going to take a stab throughout the process and, cross all the T's, dot all the I's before making a final decision. So this is going to be, one that we monitor for the next few months. But a receiver, Miami's trying to poach out of New York, which is, interesting to say that you don't hear that often. Messiah Hampton, you talked about him a little bit earlier on the show, was named Under Armour's On Threes MVP for the showing that he had. Came in from New York to compete against South Florida prospects, and he looked, right at home against, some of the best DBs that the state has to offer. He's just a silky smooth guy. Has a background in basketball. Is a state championship track athlete up there in New York as well. Looked really good. Came in rocking, Miami book bag, had Miami sandals on. Just was rocking the Canes and had a lot of great things to say about that program. Steven, you caught up with Messiah. What's the latest? Where do you think things stand with him with the Canes too?
Miami's doing really well with Messiah. He showed up in a Miami backpack. I think that kind of says something about the position that Miami is in for a kid from New York. To be fair, he does have a ton of Florida connections. He has family in Tampa. He lives in New York. He's planning on attending high school in New York this year. But I love the position that Miami is in for him. I'm starting to like him more and more as a player. The more that I'm able to watch, some of his tapes, some of his highlights, and then even getting to see him today in person. I mean, I just thought he was a straight up baller. I thought he looked freaking awesome. I'm really excited to keep seeing more of him. I really like the job that Miami is doing right now. Definitely not calling Miami a front runner or a team to beat or anything like that by any stretch. But I do really think that Miami's doing an awesome job right now.
Yeah, I agree with you. He's the type of guy that, like you said, saw him in person. He said, wow, he looks better than his tape. And I think it was just honestly, competing against better competition and seeing the level that he rose to that really caught my attention, on Sunday when we were watching Messiah Hampton. So another wide receiver target that the Canes are really high on, and, really excited to see kind of how this board, unfolds with, new names popping in, names falling off and things like that. And then going to switch to the opposite side of the ball. One guy I really do want to highlight Florida State 4-star safety commit to Darius Hughes. He's a guy that Steven and I were talking about extensively throughout the camp of just how, much better he's gotten over these last few months. Obviously, he was a talented recruit, but he's really taken that next step and solidified himself as one of the better safeties in the 2026 class. And he's a super, super rangy guy. Played his high school ball at South Dade last year, making the move to Miami Northwestern. And obviously committed to Florida State, but things are, pretty, in my opinion, a little bit, open. Obviously, he's listening to Miami, and I had the chance to speak, with someone close in the circle, and they had a lot of great things to say about Will Harris. Also said to Darius, grew up a Miami fan too, as a lot of kids in South Florida do. But Florida State came in early, the end of that commitment, but he's not shutting the door on the Canes. And they like the staff of the moves on the defensive side of the ball for the Canes, which is playing a role in Hughes's recruitment right now. Going to take an official visit to Miami in the summer, which is going to give the Canes a really good chance to flip the local talent, which I think they have a good shot of doing. Steven, just what are your thoughts, on Darius Hughes' prospect and that recruitment as well?
Man, I mean, you talk about a kid who's improved over the last 6 months. I think Hughes has made as large a leap as anyone. I remember, the first time that I had a chance to see him, I was kind of like, man, this, I'm not really, crazy impressed or anything like that. I guess some of these schools, have, really big interest in him, but, I just don't know if I see it. He's a stud. This kid has turned into a baller. He's another guy that I think Miami's doing a really good job with. South Florida talent, as a whole, maybe a little bit more balanced this year than it's been in previous years. Now obviously probably doesn't have the same offensive line talent or defensive line talent, kind of in the trenches as maybe in some years past. But man, I really like him as much as anyone from a defensive back standpoint. I really think that he's emerged as a guy that I think is as good as any defensive back in the country. On3, I think has him listed as a top 200 prospect. He's now a 4-star recruit, obviously committed to Florida State. Miami's still pushing very, very hard. But man, he looked awesome today. He looked really, really good. I'd say he's a stock-up guy.
Yeah, and another Florida State commit that want to talk to about as well is Karan Maycock out of Miami Central. I feel like Florida State does a great job of getting in these South Florida kids' recruitments really, really early, landing that commitment, and then they have to play that long game of trying to keep them in the class. Karan Maycock is another example of that. He's a guy that the Miami Hurricanes have been all over, close to almost 2 years now with Derek Nicholson being on the staff. Obviously, him leaving had a bit of an impact on where things stand, but Karan is still listening to the Canes. Is going to be down there during the spring, and I am the official visit as well too. You had a chance to talk with him extensively on Sunday. Just what were your thoughts about what happened with that Florida State commitment? Where did things really stand with the Hurricanes?
Yeah, obviously, I mean, he felt the time was right. He wanted to go ahead and pull the trigger early. He wanted to go ahead and get committed, which I absolutely think that there's some real value in. But I absolutely believe Miami is right there, and I don't think Miami is going anywhere. He's going to be back on Miami's campus tomorrow. I think the Hurricanes are in as good a spot as anyone. I feel great about Miami's chances for him. Hurricanes are continuing to do a really good job. Obviously, he has a ton of connections over at Miami as well. He's got friends over there. He's got I guess not former coaches, but coaches from Miami Central but a coach from Miami Central who he would respect over there. Miami's done a really good job maintaining the pipeline to Miami Central. I think the Hurricanes will ultimately end up doing enough to get him in the class, but that's just kind of what I think right now. I do not know that for a fact, but this early, I never really trust a commitment that comes in February unless it's a quarterback who's absolutely completely shutting things down. But I do like the job that Miami's doing with him.
And then our last flip target on the defensive side of the ball for this recruiting podcast, Brody Jennings, Mandarin guy out of Jacksonville, committed to Michigan Wolverines, but has a ton of ties to the University of Miami. Sister currently runs track there. His older brother played football there, but his dad played football at Florida State. Steven, what's the latest for Brody Jennings, a guy that was named the cornerback MVP of today's Under Armour camp series in Miami?
Yeah, if it looks like a duck, if it walks like a duck, if it quacks like a duck, it's a duck. And man, that's Brody Jennings. He is your prototypical corner. He's long, he's lanky, he's quick. He plays with really good hip level. He does great job keeping receivers in front of him. Redirecting guys off the line of scrimmage, running with guys in man-to-man coverage. Michigan's evaluation of cornerback, or Michigan's evaluation process of evaluating kids early period is just beyond impressive. They were on Chris Ewald way before the rest of the recruiting services really bumped him up and marked him as one of these early targets to watch. I really like the job that Michigan did evaluating Brody Jennings as well, because Brody was a guy who was kind of a fringe 3-star, 4-star guy whenever Michigan earned his commitment. But man, I really think that Brody today kind of proved why he's as good as anyone in the country, and why he's one of these guys that Florida's 3 major in-state schools are really going to fight like hell to keep in state. It's Florida, it's Miami, it's Florida State. They are fighting and fighting and fighting to keep him in the Sunshine State. They absolutely want to keep him home. But right now, Brody, he's playing his cards pretty close to the chest. It's hard to determine just who sits where for him. Him and his camp, they're being very smart. They're doing a really, really good job. Making sure that, information is only out there if they want it to be out there. But I do believe that any 3 of the in-state schools could still be a likely landing spot for him.
And with that being said, that's all that we have for today's episode of Inside Canes Recruiting Podcast. If you guys like this show, let us know in the comments. Leave a big like and subscribe to Canes Sports YouTube if you haven't already. Make sure to head to canesport.com as well for all your latest Miami Hurricanes news as we continue to talk the latest scoop for recruiting. And with spring football coming up, we'll have you covered with all the latest Miami team news as well. For Stephen Wagner, I'm Izubee Charles. Thank you all for watching. Have a great rest of your day.